How will you define rhetoric to someone?
So I'm not very good at defining rhetoric succinctly, but if I had to define it as succinctly as possible, I might say it's the study and practice of how individual actants, which normally we think of as humans, but could also be other objects or people, move one another to action through direct and indirect means. So what I would try to pull in is not only the intentional, persuasive, conscious aspects of rhetoric, but also some of the ways that we study rhetoric as a part of the body, a part of our unconscious actions that can also influence others in ways that affect the way they interact with their own environments or move around in the environment. So it can be bodies and not only words. There's a long definition for you.
Why is it important to take a rhetoric class?
Well, I think that with that broad definition, you can start to see that rhetoric covers every discipline. Before there were specific disciplines for politics and persuasion and literary study, there was simply rhetoric. And the early rhetoricians understood that language influenced the way they acted, the way they thought, the way they interacted with one another in all areas of society. So I would say that for someone wanting to be better at their practices with other people, whether that's in business or maybe in politics, or even someone who wants to go on to be an educator, the study of rhetoric is really influential in how we understand others, how we learn to engage with others. For other people who are really interested in a philosophical background and have an intellectual bent, I think that rhetoric is attractive in that it provides a space for reflecting on the ways that we engage other people and the ways that we move other people to action. One of those components can even be ethical. Are the actions that we take good? Are the actions that we take, do they lead people to happy consequences? So all of those questions are contained within rhetoric. And again, there's that component of practice that's always involved in any kind of rhetorical speculation. That we, as rhetoricians, are not only interested in sitting and thinking about the best things to do in our society, but we're also interested in the consequences that follow from trying to put those ideas into practice.
To what students would it benefit the most to take?
Who does rhetoric benefit the most? I think that it's difficult to say. I mean, look across the history of rhetoric. You have politicians, leaders of their cities, warlords. You have people who were interested in manipulating others, that were interested in personal gain. As the history wore on, you had people who were courtiers in the realms of powerful kings who used rhetoric to gain influence. And into the 20th century, when rhetoric has been influential in how we understand science, how we understand the politics around us, how we understand global and international policies, international relations. So who can benefit from rhetoric? Everyone can benefit from rhetoric. And I think the really interesting thing is that rhetoric rewards the study that we put into it. So people who only have a little bit of time to study rhetoric can gain an advantage in the way that they interact with other people, whether that's better listening patterns, better receptivity, or better production, better ways of persuading and engaging with others. The amount of time that you spend studying and engaging with rhetoric, I think, allows a wide degree of actions possible. So the easy answer is everyone can benefit from studying rhetoric, but I do believe that it has a strong and effective role to play in the way that we all take part in our roles as citizens in American society. Everyone can take it.
What other career fields do you think rhetoric interacts with or aligns with the best?
I've said that rhetoric in some ways was the first discipline. And so before there were literary studies or politics as such, you had rhetoricians who were very interested in the way that language played a part in how citizens interacted with their society, whether that was with formal education or just in the ways they interacted with one another on the street. So in some ways, rhetoric interacts with every discipline. And again, these are some of those easy answers, but for rhetoricians, this is really important, that what we study is foundational to not just a specific kind of discipline that you can have as a major, but what we study really has a part in the way that we engage in our society widely, whether it's through formal political action or whether it's simply through the ways that we interact with our family members and understand our discourses with other strangers or neighbors in the community. Having said that, I know that some of our former rhetoric and writing graduates have gone on to have experiences with law and political science, political and social policy. We've had students go on to study music, and we've also had students go on to be politicians themselves and use the rhetorical practices to campaign on the political trail. So I think there's a natural fit with politics, there's a natural fit with social policy, partly because contemporary rhetoric is really attuned to how wide audiences understand what the rhetorician is saying and how they understand their place in society. But I also wouldn't count out the way that rhetoric as a field allows entry points into things that you might not otherwise consider, whether that's the sciences, studying biotechnology, for example, whether that's something more familiar like linguistic study, or I would imagine even wider fields. If you were interested in performance, rhetoricians for centuries have had a really strong interest in how actors use their bodies, how they use gesture, how they use the tone of their voice to engage audiences. So because rhetoric has been interested in everything from very broad philosophical questions to very specific practical questions about how we run and manage our society, it allows openings into really wide areas of our contemporary society and really wide experiences in careers or even other areas of study and scholarship as well.
What got you curious about rhetoric?
I became curious about rhetoric when I was studying literature in graduate school. I took a course that was focused on how we learn how to write and ancient rhetorical practices. And what really struck me about the class and the subject material was that, unlike the other things I had been studying in literary studies classes, rhetoric was really practice focused. And I liked the idea that I could study something that would also help me learn how to be either a better person or learn how to act with more political sophistication in my community. And so it was really the practical aspects that drew me into rhetoric in the first place. I thought it was a really interesting and deep area of study. I hadn't really ever studied anything from the ancient Greek and Roman thinkers before. And so I was fascinated by the idea that we had 2,000 years of this kind of study. The more that I focused on rhetorical practices, the more interested I became in the ways that ancient rhetoricians had used rhetoric to influence their communities and really sometimes change their entire societies, and the way that societies ended up having influence across the entire Mediterranean area as well. So rhetoric and practice were really the things that drew me into what I was most curious about.
Do you have a best class moment?
I think that, this is my biased opinion, but I think that rhetoric and writing students are the most fun. I'd say the most intelligent, the most engaged students of all the students that I've taught. And so I like in my classes to try to bring our own personal experiences into the learning environment. In past classes, my favorite moments have been moments when I'm able to draw on a personal, something that happened to me or something that happened to one of the students and use it to engage students in the lesson that we're teaching for that day. So I do have a couple of fun moments in the past. I remember one moment we were trying to talk about Descartes and his idea that in order to really be a true rhetorician, you had to have wide experiences. And that day I happened to have ridden my bike from my house to school in the rain. And I looked outside and saw that the forecast was raining, but I never actually took the time to find out whether it was raining or not. So I arrived to class pretty much drenched. And instead of ducking out and making an excuse, I decided to use the experience to talk about how rhetoricians in the past really put a value on experiencing something for yourself. You could learn it in a book, but unless you got out in the rain and got drenched yourself, then you might not know the effects of what it meant to plan, for example, for the weather forecast. So on that day and on other days, I've tried to use personal experiences to teach, and those are fun moments. I also have had some great class experiences in the past focused on the content that we were studying. And one of my more memorable moments was in a class focused on rhetoric as instinct. And in that class, one of the things we studied was the influence of the senses on rhetorical interaction. So we studied scent particularly, and that faculty of smell. And I had my students, I gave them an extra credit option of trying to go back and create famous or notable senses, or scents actually, from previous historical periods. And so one of my students actually bottled up the scent of ancient Rome and looked at a recipe online and found ingredients that were going to approximate some of the perfumes that ancient Romans used. I think it smells like maple syrup, actually. But when the student took the time to actually go back and create an ancient scent and use that to think about the ways that ancient Romans might have used the sensory experience of smell, I thought that was a really wonderful way that some of the education we had in the way that scent interacts with our rhetorical experiences, I thought that brought everything home.
That's about everything.
We good?
Yeah,
We're good. Okay.